The iron shackles bit into Felicity Bradford's wrists as the stagecoach lurched over another rocky outcrop, throwing her against the wooden bench hard enough to bruise her shoulder through the thin fabric of her travel dress. She had been told this was her punishment, her father's final attempt to break her spirit after years of refusing every suitor he'd paraded before her like prized cattle at auction. The year was 1876, and respectable young women of 22 were expected to marry well and obediently, not speak their minds about women's suffrage or refuse 3 perfectly acceptable proposals because they valued their independence. So Ephraim Bradford had made arrangements with a man he'd never met, a trapper somewhere in the wilderness beyond Laramie, Wyoming, and declared that if his daughter wanted freedom so badly, she could have it in the most isolated place he could imagine. The driver barely looked at her when they stopped at her ramshackle trading post 3 days later, somewhere deep in the Medicine Bow Mountains. He simply pointed to a narrow trail that wound up through towering pines and said someone would meet her there by nightfall. Then he turned the horses around and left her standing alone with a single trunk of belongings, the afternoon sun already dipping toward the jagged peaks in the west. Felicity refused to cry. She had cried enough during the first 2 days of travel, when the reality of her situation had crashed over her like a wave. Her father had essentially sold her to a stranger, using the legal fiction of an arranged marriage to dispose of his troublesome daughter. The letters exchanged between the 2 men had been perfunctory at best, discussing her as though she were livestock being traded rather than a human being with thoughts and feelings. She knew nothing about this Yannick Brennan except that he lived alone in the mountains, trapped for furs, and had agreed to take a wife sight unseen in exchange for a sum of money her father had offered. The trail was steeper than it looked, and her fashionable boots were entirely unsuited for mountain hiking. By the time the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, her feet ached terribly, and she'd had to abandon her trunk by the side of the path, taking only what she could carry in a canvas bag she'd found strapped to the top. She was beginning to wonder if she'd die out here alone, lost in these endless mountains, when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from above. The man who emerged from between 2 massive pine trees was not what she'd expected. Felicity had braced herself for someone old, weathered, possibly cruel, the kind of man who would agree to such an arrangement because no woman would choose him willingly. Instead, she found herself staring at someone who couldn't have been more than 27 or 28, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the narrow trail and arms that strained against the rolled sleeves of his worn flannel shirt. His hair was dark brown and longer than was fashionable, tied back with a leather cord, and his face was all sharp angles and strong lines, covered with several days' worth of beard. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a startling pale blue that seemed to take in everything about her in a single sweeping glance. "Miss Bradford." His voice was deep, rougher than the refined tone she was accustomed to, but not unkind. "I'm Yannick Brennan. Your father's letter said you'd be arriving today, Mr. Brennan." She straightened her spine, determined not to show how exhausted and frightened she felt. "I seem to have had to leave most of my belongings down the trail. The trunk was too heavy." Something shifted in his expression, though she couldn't quite read it. He nodded once, then started back down the path without a word. Felicity stood frozen for a moment before realizing he was retrieving her trunk. She watched as he descended the steep trail with an ease that spoke of years navigating this terrain, and when he reached the trunk, he lifted it onto one shoulder as though it weighed nothing at all. The display of sheer strength should not have made her pulse quicken, but it did. "The cabin's another mile up," he said when he returned to where she stood. "Can you make it, or do you need me to carry you too?" There was no mockery in the question, just a practical assessment of her capabilities. Felicity lifted her chin. "I can walk." He studied her for another moment, then nodded and started up the trail. She followed, gritting her teeth against the pain in her feet and refusing to ask him to slow down. If this was to be her life now, she would not begin it by showing weakness. The cabin appeared suddenly as they crested a ridge, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and aspens. It was larger than she'd anticipated, built from thick logs chinked with what looked like clay and moss, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a covered porch running along the front. Behind it, she could see a small barn and what might have been a chicken coop. The setting sun cast everything in warm, golden light, and despite her circumstances, Felicity felt something in her chest ease slightly. It was beautiful here, in a wild and untamed way that Boston had never been. Yannick set her trunk down on the porch and opened the heavy wooden door, gesturing for her to enter first. The interior was dim after the brightness outside, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw a single large room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove, and a bed in the far corner covered with what looked like a thick bearskin. The walls were lined with shelves holding supplies, tools, and equipment she couldn't identify. Everything was neat and well organized, not at all the squalor she'd half expected. "You'll take the bed," Yannick said, setting her trunk beside it. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." Felicity turned to face him. "Mr. Brennan, I think we should discuss the nature of this arrangement." He crossed his arms over that impressive chest, leaning against the door frame. "All right. My father made certain promises in his letters to you, I assume. About marriage, about my duties as a wife." She forced herself to maintain eye contact. "I want you to know that I was given no choice in this matter. I was told I was being sent here as punishment for refusing to be the obedient daughter he wanted. So whatever he promised you, whatever you expect from me, I need to understand it clearly." Yannick was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he straightened and moved to the fireplace, beginning to build a fire with practiced efficiency. "Your father offered me money to marry you. Said you were headstrong and needed a firm hand to break you to proper behavior. I told him I wasn't interested in breaking anyone or taking his money, but if his daughter wanted to escape Boston badly enough to come out here, I'd give her a place to stay and see how things went." Felicity felt her mouth fall open slightly. "You refused his money." "I don't want a wife I have to pay for, Miss Bradford." He struck a match and held it to the kindling, watching as flames caught and began to spread. "And I don't want a woman who's here because she has no other choice. So here's what I propose. You stay here for the winter. Learn what mountain life is like. Come spring, if you want to leave, I'll take you back to Laramie myself and you can make your own way from there. If you decide to stay, then we can talk about marriage. Real marriage between 2 people who choose it." The tears she'd been holding back for days suddenly threatened to spill over. She blinked them away furiously. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." He turned to face her, and in the firelight his features seemed softer. "I know what it's like to have your life controlled by someone else's expectations. My father wanted me to take over his mercantile business in St. Louis, marry the daughter of his business partner, live the life he'd planned out for me. I came out here 8 years ago because I couldn't breathe in that world. So no, I don't know you, Miss Bradford, but I know what it's like to need an escape." Felicity sank down onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet. Winter up here is hard, and this life isn't anything like what you're used to. You might be begging me to take you back to civilization within a week." He moved to the kitchen area and began pulling out supplies. "But for tonight, you're safe. That's enough." She watched as he prepared a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and cornbread, moving around the small space with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He heated water for tea and set out tin plates and cups without any of the fuss or ceremony she was accustomed to. When he handed her a plate, their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt a spark of something she couldn't quite name. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Felicity found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, noting the way his powerful hands dwarfed the tin cup he held, the breadth of his shoulders, the quiet confidence in every movement. He was nothing like the soft, refined men who had courted her in Boston, all smooth words and carefully practiced manners. Yannick Brennan seemed carved from the same stone as these mountains, solid and enduring. "Tell me about this place," she said finally, setting down her empty plate. "How did you come to live here?" He leaned back in his chair, cradling his cup. "After I left St. Louis, I worked as a guide for a few years, taking hunting parties and settlers through the mountains. Saved my money and bought this land from an old trapper who was heading back east. Built the cabin with help from some Shoshone friends who have a camp about 10 miles north. I trap in winter, hunt and prospect a bit in summer, trade furs in Laramie twice a year. It's a simple life, but it's mine. You ever get lonely?" Something flickered in his eyes. "Sometimes. But I'd rather be lonely on my own terms than surrounded by people in a life that doesn't fit me." Felicity understood that in her bones. "My father couldn't comprehend why I'd refuse good marriages. He said I was being foolish, throwing away security for some childish notion of independence. But the thought of spending my life as an ornament in someone's parlor, expected to produce children and keep quiet about anything that mattered, it felt like a kind of death. So he sent you here to teach you a lesson. To break my spirit, I think. Show me how hard life could be without his protection and provision." She looked around the cabin, at the rough-hewn logs and simple furnishings. "But honestly, Mr. Brennan, sitting here eating beans in a mountain cabin feels more honest than any of those elaborate dinner parties where everyone said exactly what was expected and meant none of it." He smiled then, just a slight curve of his lips, but it transformed his face entirely. "Call me Yannick. If we're going to be living in close quarters, we should probably dispense with formalities. Felicity," she offered, "or Fliss if you prefer. My younger brother couldn't pronounce my full name when he was small. You have a brother, had. Jonathan died of scarlet fever when he was 7. I was 14. The old grief was a familiar weight. After that, my father became obsessed with control. I think he couldn't bear losing anyone else, so he tried to dictate every aspect of my life to keep me safe. It only pushed me further away." Yannick nodded slowly. "Loss does strange things to people. I'm sorry about your brother." "Thank you." She hesitated, then asked, "What about your family? Do they know where you are?" "My mother died when I was born. My father remarried when I was 10, and I have 3 half-sisters back in St. Louis. We exchange letters occasionally when I can get mail sent. They're good girls, happily married to men who actually love them. My father still thinks I'll come to my senses one day and return to civilized society." "Will you?" He met her gaze directly. "Never. This is where I belong." The conviction in his voice sent a strange thrill through her. She had never met anyone so certain of their place in the world, so unapologetic about choosing their own path. In Boston, everyone seemed to be performing roles assigned to them, playing parts in a play they hadn't written. But Yannick Brennan was entirely himself, solid and real in a way that made her want to cry and laugh at the same time. After dinner, he showed her where the water pump was located outside, how to work the kitchen stove, where supplies were stored. He moved a privacy screen to create a separate area around the bed for her, and brought in fresh water for washing. Through it all, he maintained a careful distance, never touching her unnecessarily, always respecting her space. It was more consideration than any of her supposed suitors had ever shown. That night, lying in the strange bed under the heavy bearskin, listening to the wind sigh through the pines outside and the crackle of the dying fire, Felicity felt something unfamiliar settle over her. It took her a long time to identify it as hope. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Gray dawn light filtered through the cabin's small windows, and she could hear Yannick moving quietly in the kitchen area, trying not to wake her. She dressed quickly behind the screen, grateful for the privacy he'd arranged, and emerged to find him setting out breakfast. "Morning," he said, glancing up. "Hope I didn't wake you." "No, I've always been an early riser." She moved to help, unsure what to do but wanting to be useful. "What can I do? Can you cook? I can make toast without burning it, usually." At his raised eyebrow, she added, "We had a cook in Boston, and a housekeeper and a lady's maid. I wasn't encouraged to learn practical skills. Then I guess we start there." He pulled out a skillet. "Come here. I'll teach you to make proper camp eggs." For the next hour, Yannick patiently instructed her in the basics of cooking over a wood stove, showing her how to regulate the heat, when to flip eggs, how to test if bacon was done. His hands were enormous beside hers, scarred and calloused from hard work, but surprisingly gentle when he guided her movements. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the combination of wood smoke and pine, and something essentially masculine that made her pulse race. "There," he said when she successfully plated a passable breakfast. "That wasn't so hard. You're a patient teacher." She carried the plates to the table. "I expected you to be frustrated with my incompetence. Everyone has to learn. No shame in not knowing something." He poured coffee for them both, strong and black. "Besides, you'll need these skills if you decide to stay through winter. I'll be checking trap lines for days at a time, and you'll need to manage on your own." The reminder that this was a temporary arrangement, that she was essentially on trial to see if she could survive this life, dampened her good mood slightly. "When do you next check your traps?" "Day after tomorrow." "I'll only be gone overnight this time, just making sure everything's ready for when the snows really start, but I need to teach you a lot before then." He wasn't exaggerating. Over the next 2 days, Yannick gave her a crash course in mountain survival. He showed her how to split firewood, though her first attempts were clumsy and he had to step in to prevent her from injuring herself. He taught her to recognize the signs of approaching weather by watching the sky and the behavior of animals. He demonstrated how to draw water from the pump without spilling half of it, how to tend the small flock of chickens in the coop, how to identify which supplies needed careful rationing and which were plentiful. Every task revealed just how sheltered and useless her upbringing had made her. In Boston, she'd been educated in literature, music, basic mathematics, and social graces. She could discuss current events intelligently, play piano tolerably well, and manage a formal tea service with ease. None of that meant anything here, where survival depended on practical skills she'd never imagined needing. But Yannick never made her feel stupid or inadequate. When she struggled, he adjusted his teaching method. When she succeeded, he offered quiet praise that made her chest warm with pride. And when she grew frustrated with her own clumsiness, he reminded her that he'd had years to learn these things and she'd had 2 days. "You're doing better than you think," he said on the second evening as they sat by the fire after dinner. "Most city folk wouldn't even try half of what you've tackled today. I'm not sure I have much choice." She flexed her sore hands, already developing small calluses from unfamiliar work. "But I appreciate your patience." "It's not patience. You're a quick learner when you stop doubting yourself." He poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "Tomorrow I'll head out at first light. You'll be all right here alone." "I'll have to be, won't I?" She tried to sound more confident than she felt. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll leave you the rifle." "Do you know how to shoot?" "I've never even held a gun." That earned her another of those rare smiles. "Then we better have one more lesson before bed." Outside in the gathering dusk, Yannick retrieved a rifle from the cabin and showed her how to hold it properly, how to sight along the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger smoothly rather than jerking it. The weapon was heavier than she expected, and the first time she fired it, the recoil nearly knocked her backward. But Yannick was right there, his solid presence steadying her, his hands guiding hers to the correct position. "Again," he said quietly. "You're flinching before you pull the trigger. Trust the rifle and trust yourself." After a dozen attempts, she finally hit the tree trunk he designated as a target. The satisfaction of seeing the fresh scar in the bark where her shot had landed was surprisingly intense. "Good." Yannick's approval was warm in his voice. "Hopefully you won't need it, but if you do, aim for center mass and don't hesitate." "What would I be shooting at?" The question came out smaller than she intended. "Probably nothing. Wildlife up here tends to avoid humans. But if a bear or mountain lion comes around, fire a shot in the air and it'll usually scare them off. If it doesn't, then you aim to kill." He took the rifle back and showed her how to reload it. "More important is knowing you can defend yourself. That confidence matters." They returned to the cabin as full darkness fell, and Felicity found herself dreading the morning when Yannick would leave. In just 3 days, his steady presence had become a source of comfort she hadn't expected. He was nothing like what she'd feared when she first learned of this arrangement, nothing like the brutal mountain man her father had described. Instead, he was patient, respectful, competent in ways that made her feel safe for the first time since leaving Boston. That night, lying in bed while he banked the fire for the night, she worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her. "Yannick, why did you really agree to this arrangement? You said you turned down my father's money, but you still agreed to let me come here. Why?" He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, his voice came out of the darkness. "I've been alone up here for 8 years. It's the life I chose, and I don't regret it, but there are times when the silence gets heavy. When I got your father's letter, underneath all his bluster about taming your wild spirit, I could read between the lines. You sounded like someone trapped in a life that didn't fit, someone who valued freedom enough to risk everything for it. That took courage. I guess I wanted to meet someone with that kind of courage, and maybe give you the chance nobody gave me to choose your own path." Felicity felt tears prick her eyes again. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me as a person instead of a problem to be solved. Get some rest, Fliss. Tomorrow's going to be a long day for both of us." She listened as his breathing gradually evened out into sleep, and found herself hoping desperately that she could prove worthy of the chance he was giving her. Not because she owed him anything, but because somewhere in the last 3 days, she'd started to believe that maybe this wild, impossible place could actually become home. Morning came too quickly. Yannick was up before dawn, loading supplies into a pack with efficient movements. He'd already made coffee and left bread and cheese on the table for her breakfast. Felicity dressed hurriedly and came out to find him checking his knife, rifle, and various other equipment she couldn't identify. "There's stew in the pot over the fire," he said without looking up. "Just keep it warm and it'll be good for both meals today. Check the chickens morning and evening. Don't go more than 50 yards from the cabin, and if you hear anything that sounds wrong, get inside and bar the door. What does wrong sound like? Now he did look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. You'll know. Trust your instincts. He finished strapping on his pack and picked up his rifle. I'll be back by tomorrow evening. You'll be fine. She walked out onto the porch with him, hugging herself against the morning chill. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, and the mountains stretched away in every direction, endless and beautiful and terrifying. Yannick. She stopped him as he reached the edge of the clearing. Be careful. He turned back, and for a moment something warm flickered in those pale blue eyes. Always am. You too, Fliss. Then he was gone, disappearing into the forest with the kind of silent grace she wouldn't have thought possible in someone so large. Felicity stood on the porch until the last sound of his passage faded, then went back inside to face her first day alone in the wilderness. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. She tended the chickens, grateful for Yannick's thorough instructions. She practiced splitting kindling, managing to avoid injuring herself. She kept the fire going and stirred the stew periodically, tasted it, and was surprised by how good it was, rich with meat and vegetables and herbs she couldn't identify. She tried to read one of the books on Yannick's shelves, a worn copy of Washington Irving's Tales, but couldn't concentrate. Every sound outside made her jump. The wind in the pines sounded like footsteps. The call of a distant eagle made her reach for the rifle. By the time afternoon shadows began to lengthen, her nerves were stretched taut as wire. She was carrying water from the pump when she heard it, a sound that definitely qualified as wrong. It was a deep, huffing grunt coming from somewhere behind the cabin, followed by the crash of something heavy moving through brush. Felicity froze, her heart hammering, remembering Yannick's instructions. She forced herself to move calmly but quickly back to the cabin, secured the water bucket, and grabbed the rifle from beside the door. The animal, whatever it was getting closer. She could hear it snuffling and grunting, could hear the scrape of claws on wood. It was at the chicken coop. Every instinct screamed at her to bar the door and hide, but those chickens were part of what would feed her through the winter. Part of what fed Yannick. She couldn't just let something destroy them. Felicity stepped out onto the porch, rifle raised, and came face to face with the largest bear she could have imagined. It was at the chicken coop, trying to tear through the wooden slats while the terrified birds squawked and fluttered inside. The bear was massive, easily as tall as her at the shoulder, with dark brown fur and enormous paws tipped with claws as long as her fingers. "Hey!" Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "Get away from there." The bear's head swung toward her, small eyes fixing on her with unnerving intelligence. For a moment, they stared at each other. Then the bear huffed again and took a step in her direction. Felicity raised the rifle and fired into the air, just as Yannick had instructed. The report echoed off the mountains, and the bear reared back, startled. For one horrible moment, she thought it was going to charge. But then it dropped to all fours, gave one more huffing grunt that sounded almost annoyed, and lumbered off into the forest. She stood frozen on the porch for several minutes after it disappeared, shaking so hard she had to lean the rifle against the cabin wall before she dropped it. When her legs would finally support her again, she went to check the chicken coop. The bears had damaged a few slats, but the structure was intact, and the chickens, while terrified, were unharmed. That evening, she repaired the damage as best she could with nails and boards she found in the barn, wedging extra support pieces against the weakened areas. She hauled additional water to have on hand in case of fire. She checked and rechecked that the door and windows were secure, and she forced herself to eat stew even though her stomach was still churning with residual fear and adrenaline. When darkness fell and she was finally safe behind barred doors, Felicity allowed herself to acknowledge how terrified she'd been. But underneath, the fear was something else, something bright and fierce. She had faced down a bear and survived. She had protected the chickens, repaired the damage, taken care of everything Yannick had left in her charge. For the first time in her life, she had been tested by something real and immediate, and she hadn't crumbled. She fell asleep that night feeling more capable than she ever had in 22 years of sheltered city life. Yannick returned the following evening just as the sun was setting, emerging from the forest trail with his pack and rifle. Felicity, who had been watching for him anxiously for the past hour, flew off the porch without thinking and stopped herself just short of embracing him. "You're back," she said, suddenly self-conscious about her obvious relief. His eyes searched her face, then moved past her to take in the cabin and surrounding area. "Everything all right? You look pale." "A bear came yesterday afternoon. It tried to get into the chicken coop." She saw his expression tighten and hurried on. "I fired into the air like you told me and it left. The chickens are fine. I repaired the damage to the coop." Yannick set down his pack carefully and walked over to examine the coop. She followed nervously, unsure if her repairs would meet his standards. He crouched down to inspect her work, running his hands over the new boards and supports. "This is good work," he said finally, looking up at her. "Really good, especially for your first time." "I was terrified," she admitted. "But I remembered what you said about not going more than 50 yards from the cabin, and the coop was right here, and I couldn't just let it destroy everything." He straightened, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "You did exactly right. Most people would have hidden and hoped for the best. You faced the danger and handled it." He paused, then added quietly, "I'm proud of you, Fliss." The words wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. Her father had never said he was proud of her, not once in her entire life. She'd been a disappointment, a problem, a burden to be managed. But here in the wilderness, having faced down a bear and survived a day alone, this near stranger with calloused hands and kind eyes was proud of her. "Thank you," she managed past the lump in her throat. They went inside, and while Yannick unpacked his gear, Felicity warmed up the last of the stew and made cornbread under his direction. Over dinner, he told her about his trap lines, the areas he'd checked, the signs he'd seen of a hard winter coming. She told him more about the bear encounter, describing every detail she could remember. He listened carefully, occasionally asking questions, treating her account with the same seriousness he'd give another experienced trapper. "The bear will probably come back," he said when she finished. "They're persistent when they've found a food source. We'll need to reinforce the coop more thoroughly, maybe hang some bells that'll make noise if something disturbs them. But you handled it well for a first encounter." "I never imagined I could do something like that. In Boston, if I saw a rat, I'd call for someone to deal with it." She shook her head wonderingly. "Out here, I just did what needed doing. That's mountain life. You adapt or you don't survive." He refilled her coffee cup. "The question is, can you see yourself doing this long term? Because this was just one day alone. Winter up here lasts months, and there'll be storms that keep us snowed in for days at a time. No society, no entertainments, just survival and whatever company we can provide each other." Felicity considered carefully before answering. "I won't lie and say I'm not scared. This is so far outside anything I've ever experienced. But you know what's strange? I feel more alive here than I ever did in Boston. There, every day was the same. The same people saying the same things, the same empty rituals, the same feeling that I was sleepwalking through a life that had nothing to do with who I actually am. Here, even being terrified and facing a bear, I felt present, real, like I mattered because what I did had real consequences. Yannick studied her in the firelight, his expression unreadable. Your father would probably say those are the exact words of someone who's lost their mind. My father lost any right to define my sanity when he sent me away as punishment. She met his gaze steadily. I know I have a lot more to learn. I know there will be hard days. But I want to try, Yannick. I want to see if I can make a life here. Something shifted in his face, a wall coming down that she hadn't even realized was there. Then we'll make sure you learn everything you need to know. Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened toward winter, Yannick became her guide to mountain life in earnest. He taught her to cure meat, to preserve vegetables in the root cellar he dug beneath the cabin, to render fat for candles and soap. He showed her how to mend her own clothes with the tough stitching needed for garments that had to withstand hard use. He took her hunting and taught her to track deer through the forest, to read signs in broken branches and disturbed earth, to move silently through terrain that wanted to announce her presence with every step. She was a terrible shot at first, missing target after target until her shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil. But Yannick was endlessly patient, adjusting her stance, coaching her breathing, celebrating when she finally brought down a rabbit at 50 yards. The pride in his eyes when she succeeded meant more than any compliment she'd received at fancy dinner parties. They fell into rhythms together, working side by side to prepare for winter. Yannick would split firewood and Felicity would stack it under the porch overhang. He would hunt, and she would help butcher and preserve the meat, learning to set aside her squeamishness in favor of practical necessity. They cooked together in the evenings, and she discovered she had a knack for making bread that earned rare praise from her taciturn teacher. The physical work was harder than anything she'd done in her pampered life, and she fell into bed exhausted every night. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from accomplishment rather than boredom. Her soft hands developed calluses, and her body grew stronger, adapting to the demands she placed on it. The fashionable dresses she'd brought from Boston gave way to practical split skirts and sturdy shirts more suited to mountain life. And through it all, she became increasingly aware of Yannick himself. The way his muscles moved under his shirt when he swung an axe, the rare smiles that transformed his serious face, the gentleness in his calloused hands when he showed her a delicate task. The way his eyes tracked her movements when he thought she wasn't looking, something warm and almost wondering in his expression. She caught herself watching him too, admiring the sheer competence with which he moved through his world. Everything he did with absolute confidence born of years of experience. He was strong without being brutish, capable without being arrogant, kind without being soft. He treated her as an equal even when her skills didn't match his, and he never once made her feel small or inadequate for not knowing things. The first major snowfall came in late October, covering the world in a blanket of white that muffled all sound. Felicity woke to find Yannick already up, stoking the fire against the cold that had seeped through the cabin walls overnight. "Winter's here for real now," he said when he saw her awake. "From here on out, we need to be smart about every trip outside. Weather up here can turn deadly in minutes." He spent that day teaching her about cold weather survival, how to recognize the signs of frostbite and hypothermia, what to do if she got caught in a blizzard. He showed her the rope he'd strung from the cabin to the barn and chicken coop, explaining that in a whiteout, even that short distance could become disorienting and dangerous. "If you lose sight of the cabin in a storm, follow the rope back," he said firmly. Don't try to navigate by landmarks. People have frozen to death 20 feet from their own front door because they got turned around in the snow. The intensity in his voice told her this wasn't hypothetical. Has that happened to someone you knew? His jaw tightened. A friend. My first winter up here. He was experienced, should have known better, but he got overconfident. By the time I found him, it was too late. Felicity reached out without thinking and touched his arm. I'm sorry. Yannick looked down at her hand on his arm, and something electric passed between them. For a moment, she thought he might pull her closer, might close the distance between them that had been slowly shrinking over weeks of working side by side. But then he stepped back gently, putting space between them. We should check the trap lines before the next storm hits, he said, his voice carefully neutral. The moment passed, but Felicity felt its echo through the rest of the day. Something was building between them, something neither of them had acknowledged aloud. She wasn't sure if Yannick was holding back out of respect for their agreement, giving her the space to decide what she wanted without pressure, or if he was uncertain of his own feelings. But she was becoming increasingly certain of hers. She was falling in love with him. It wasn't the dramatic, sweeping passion of romantic novels. It was quieter than that, built on small moments and gradual understanding. It was the way he always made sure she had the warmest blanket on cold nights. The way he listened when she talked about books she'd read or ideas she'd been considering, treating her thoughts as valuable rather than dismissing them as women's fancies. The way he laughed, rare and genuine, when she made a joke. The way he'd started singing quietly while he worked, old ballads in a surprisingly good baritone, because he'd noticed music made her happy. She loved the person he was when he thought no one was watching, gentle with injured animals they found in the forest, patient with the chickens when they scattered instead of going into their coop, careful to take only what he needed from the land and no more. She loved his strength and his competence, but also the vulnerability he showed in rare, unguarded moments. When he talked about his loneliness in the years before she came or his continuing disappointment that his father couldn't understand his choices. And she was increasingly certain that he felt something for her too, even if he was too honorable to act on it while she was technically still deciding whether to stay. The next time Yannick had to check distant trap lines, he asked if she wanted to come with him. It would be a full day's journey there and back, he warned, and they'd be camping overnight in the wilderness. But he'd been teaching her wilderness skills for weeks now, and he thought she was ready. Felicity agreed immediately, both because she wanted to prove her capability and because the thought of spending extended time alone with him made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. They set out at dawn, each carrying a pack with supplies. Yannick led the way up trails that were barely visible under the snow, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of this terrain. Felicity followed, focusing on stepping where he stepped, keeping the pace he set. The air was crisp and cold, turning her breath to clouds, but the exercise kept her warm. Yannick pointed out things as they went. Animal tracks in the snow, edible plants she should remember for spring, landmarks to use for navigation. He showed her how to read the forest the way he did, as a text full of information if you knew how to interpret it. They reached his first trap line by midday and found 2 traps had been sprung successfully. Yannick reset them efficiently, then showed Felicity how to prepare the pelts for transport. It was messy work, but she'd grown accustomed to that aspect of mountain life. You're not squeamish anymore, Yannick observed as she helped him pack the furs. I've learned that squeamishness is a luxury out here. If something needs doing, it needs doing, regardless of whether it's pleasant. She wiped her hands on a cloth. Though I'll admit I still don't enjoy this part. No one does, but you do it anyway, that's what matters. They continued to 3 more trap lines, finding varying degrees of success. By the time the sun began dipping toward the mountains, they'd collected a respectable number of pelts and were several miles from the cabin. Yannick led them to a small clearing sheltered by a massive overhanging rock face. "We'll camp here," he said, already unpacking supplies. "There's a spring just through those trees and the rock protects us from the wind. I've used this spot before." Working together, they set up a simple camp. Yannick built a fire while Felicity filled canteens from the spring. They heated beans and made coffee, eating as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Felicity had never seen so many stars, thousands upon thousands scattered across the vast darkness like diamonds on black velvet. "I forgot there were this many stars," she said softly, tilting her head back to take in the full expanse. "In Boston, you can barely see them through the gas lamp light and coal smoke." Yannick followed her gaze. "I never get tired of it. Some nights I come out here just to watch the sky." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them and the night settling around their small camp like a blanket. Felicity felt a sense of peace she'd never experienced before, a rightness about being exactly where she was. "Can I ask you something?" Yannick's voice broke the silence. "Of course. Why did you really refuse those proposals in Boston? Your father's letters made it sound like they were good matches, men with money and position. What was wrong with them?" Felicity considered how to explain. There was nothing wrong with them exactly. They were pleasant enough men who would have provided comfortable lives. But none of them saw me, Yannick. They saw a pretty ornament to display, a vessel for producing heirs, a hostess for their social events. None of them cared about what I thought or felt or wanted. When I tried to discuss books I'd read or ideas I'd been considering, they'd pat my hand and change the subject to something they deemed more appropriate for ladies. She poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral upward. I kept thinking, is this it? Is this all my life is supposed to be? Smiling and staying quiet and pretending I don't have thoughts of my own. It felt like slow suffocation. So I refused, and my father grew more and more angry with each refusal, until finally he decided to teach me a lesson by sending me somewhere he thought would break my spirit. "Instead, it might have saved you," Yannick said quietly. "Yes." She turned to look at him, this strong, solid man who had shown her more respect in 2 months than any of those supposedly proper suitors had in years. "You never treat me like I'm foolish for not knowing things. You teach me with patience and you listen when I talk, and you trust me to handle responsibilities even when I'm still learning. Do you know how rare that is? How precious?" His eyes caught the firelight, glowing in the darkness. "You make it sound like I'm doing something special." "I'm just treating you like a person." "Exactly, and apparently that's revolutionary." She smiled, but there was an edge of bitterness in it. "Women in my social class are treated like decorative china, valuable but fragile, kept on shelves to be admired but not used. You treat me like I'm capable of growth and learning and adaptation, like I'm strong enough to face challenges. You are strong enough. You've proven that over and over." He hesitated, then added, "When you first arrived, I honestly didn't think you'd last a week. You seemed so out of place, so unprepared for this life, but you've surprised me at every turn. You're braver than you know, Fliss." The way he said her name, soft and almost tender, made her breath catch. "I'm only brave because you made me feel safe enough to try. You gave me space to fail without judgment, and that let me succeed." They were both leaning closer to the fire now, closer to each other. The air between them felt charged with possibility, with all the things they'd been carefully not saying for weeks. "Felicity." His voice was rough. "I need you to know something." "What? When I agreed to let you come here, I told myself I was just helping someone who needed an escape. That's what I wanted it to be. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that. You became more than that. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with the words. I'm trying to give you the space you need to decide about staying without making you feel pressured. But I also need you to know that if you decide to leave in the spring, it's going to hurt. Because I've gotten used to having you here, to working beside you and teaching you things and hearing you laugh. I've gotten used to not being alone, and not just in a practical way. Felicity's heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. What are you saying? I'm saying that I'm falling for you, Fliss. Maybe I have been since the first night when you stood up to me and demanded to understand your situation instead of just accepting it. Maybe it was when you faced down that bear to protect the chickens. Or when you kept trying to split firewood even though your hands were blistered and every muscle ached. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it did. And I understand if you don't feel the same way. You're young and you've been through a lot, and you deserve to make decisions without feeling obligated to someone who gave you shelter. But I needed to be honest with you. She stared at him across the fire, this incredible man who thought she might not feel the same way, who was torturing himself trying to give her freedom even as he confessed his feelings. Yannick, you absolute fool, he blinked, clearly taken aback. Felicity stood and walked around the fire to where he sat. He looked up at her, confusion and hope warring in his expression. She reached down and took his face in her hands, those calloused, capable hands that had taught her so much. I'm falling for you too, she said clearly. I have been for weeks. Maybe from the very beginning when you refused my father's money and offered me a choice instead of demands. Every day I spend with you, I fall a little more. You're kind and strong and patient. You treat me like an equal. You make me laugh and you make me feel safe, and you make me want to be braver than I ever thought I could be. So yes, I'm falling for you, Yannick Brennan, and I don't want to wait until spring to tell you that. The joy that spread across his face was like watching the sun rise. He surged to his feet, and suddenly his arms were around her, lifting her clear off the ground in an embrace that should have been crushing, but instead felt like finally coming home. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on tight, breathing in the scent of him, wood smoke and pine and the indefinable something that was just Yannick. When he finally set her down, he kept his arms around her waist, holding her close. Are you sure? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. You don't have to decide now. I meant what I said about spring. I'm sure. I don't need until spring to know that this is where I belong. She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw beneath his beard. With you. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Felicity had never been more certain of anything in her life. When his lips met hers, it was gentle at first, almost tentative, as though he couldn't quite believe this was real. She pressed closer and the kiss deepened, became something fierce and hungry, weeks of restrained longing finally finding expression. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Yannick rested his forehead against hers. I don't want to rush you. We can take this as slow as you need. I appreciate that. But Yannick, I'm not made of china, I won't break. She smiled up at him. Though perhaps we should wait for an actual bed and a roof over our heads before we get too carried away, he laughed, and the sound filled her with warmth. Practical and romantic. Have I mentioned how much I love that about you? They held each other for a long time, swaying slightly in front of the fire, neither wanting to break the moment. Finally, Yannick led her to where he'd laid out their bedrolls, pulling them together and arranging blankets so they could sleep side by side without freezing in the mountain night. Felicity curled against his chest, her head tucked under his chin, and felt his arms come around her. This was nothing like the stilted courtship she'd endured in Boston, all formal rules and proper distance. This was real and immediate and right in a way those had never been. "Tell me something about yourself I don't know," she said into the darkness. His chest rumbled with quiet laughter. "I think you know me better than anyone else in the world at this point. What do you want to know? Something from your childhood, a happy memory." He was quiet for a moment, stroking her hair with one hand. "When I was about 8, my father took me fishing on the Mississippi. It was summer, hot as blazes, and we found this spot under a willow tree where the water was cool and deep. We fished all day and didn't catch a thing, but he didn't care. He just sat with me on the riverbank and told me stories about when he was young. It was one of the only times I felt like he actually saw me as a person instead of a project to be shaped and molded into his vision of the perfect son." That sounds lovely and sad. It was both. After that, he remarried and got busy with his new family and his business, and those moments got rarer and rarer. By the time I was 15, we barely talked except when he was lecturing me about my responsibilities. He sighed. "I think that's part of why I understand your situation so well. Having someone try to control your life for what they claim is your own good, it's suffocating. Do you ever regret leaving, miss the life you could have had?" "Never, not once in 8 years." His arms tightened around her, and especially not now. She tilted her head back to kiss his jaw. "Good answer." They talked late into the night, sharing stories and dreams and fears, the walls between them dissolving entirely. Felicity told him about her mother, who had died when she was 18, and how much she missed having another woman to talk to. Yannick told her about the Shoshone family who had befriended him when he first came to the mountains, how they'd taught him to survive when he was woefully unprepared for wilderness life. "You should meet them," he said. "Tall Elk and his wife Dancing Leaves, they'll like you. They've been telling me for years I need to find a wife, stop living alone like a hermit." "I'd like that." She paused. "Yannick, what happens next? I mean with us. What do you want to happen?" She considered carefully. "I want to stay. I want to build a life here with you. I want to learn everything you can teach me about living in these mountains. And eventually, when we're both ready, I want to marry you. For real, because we choose it, not because my father arranged it or because either of us feels obligated." "That sounds perfect to me." She could hear the smile in his voice. "Though fair warning, mountain weddings aren't fancy. Probably just the preacher from Laramie and maybe Tall Elk's family as witnesses. I don't need fancy, I just need you." She snuggled closer against him. "And maybe a proper dress. Even practical mountain women are allowed a little romance on their wedding day. I'll make sure you have whatever you want." He kissed the top of her head. "Get some sleep, Fliss. We've got a long hike back tomorrow." She drifted off in his arms, feeling safer and more content than she'd ever felt in her father's mansion, surrounded by luxury but starved for genuine connection. Here in the wilderness, sleeping on the hard ground under the stars, she'd found everything she'd been searching for without even knowing it. They returned to the cabin the next day, and everything felt different now that they'd acknowledged their feelings. The casual touches became more frequent and more lingering. Yannick would brush her hair back from her face when they talked. Felicity would rest her hand on his shoulder when she passed behind him. They'd catch each other's eyes across the cabin and smile for no reason except happiness. But they also maintained a respectful distance at night, Yannick still sleeping by the fire while Felicity took the bed. He'd made it clear he wanted to do things properly, that she deserved courtship and respect, not to be rushed into intimacy because they were living in close quarters. "We have all the time in the world," he said when she protested that he was being too much of a gentleman. "I'm not going anywhere and neither are you. Let's do this right." As November slipped into December, They fell into new rhythms as a couple preparing for a shared future. Yannick began teaching Felicity more advanced skills, the things she'd need to know if they were going to be full partners in this life. He showed her how to tan hides properly, how to identify different animal tracks and understand the stories they told, how to navigate by stars and sun when trails were buried under snow. She proved to be an eager student, soaking up everything he could teach her. Her shooting improved dramatically, and she could now bring down a deer at 100 yards. Her hands became steady and sure with a skinning knife. She learned to move through the forest silently, became attuned to the rhythms of the wilderness around them. They made plans for spring, talking about putting in a larger garden, maybe getting some goats for milk and cheese. Yannick mentioned buying lumber in Laramie to add a second room to the cabin, giving them more space. The casual way he included her in his future plans, as though there was no question she'd be there, filled her with quiet joy. In mid-December, Yannick announced that they should travel to Laramie before the worst of the winter snows made the journey impossible. He needed to sell the furs they'd collected and buy supplies that would see them through to spring. It would be several days of travel each way, and Felicity would need to help carry the load. "I'm ready," she said confidently, and she was. The pampered girl who'd arrived in September couldn't have made such a journey, but the woman she'd become could handle it. They left on a clear, cold morning, each carrying a heavy pack of furs. The trail to Laramie was longer and more difficult than the path from the trading post where she'd first arrived, winding through mountain passes and along ridge lines that made her head spin when she looked down. But Yannick was always there, steadying her when the footing was treacherous, encouraging her when she grew tired. They made camp 2 nights before reaching Laramie, and on the second night, as they lay together under the stars, Yannick pulled out a small carved wooden box. "I made this for you," he said, handing it to her. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have something that was just yours." Felicity opened the box carefully and found a delicate necklace inside, made from what looked like polished silver and turquoise. "Yannick, this is beautiful." "Where did you get it?" "I traded for the turquoise with Tall Elk last summer before I knew you were coming. I was going to sell it in Laramie, but then you arrived, and I kept thinking it would look perfect on you." He reached out to trace the line of her collarbone. "The silver I traded for in town 2 years ago. I've been working on it in the evenings when you were asleep." "You made this?" She stared at the intricate silverwork, the delicate way it complemented the turquoise stones. "I didn't know you could do this kind of work." "There's a lot of time to fill when you live alone in the mountains. I taught myself leatherwork, a bit of metalwork, carving. Keeps the hands busy during the long winters." He took the necklace from the box and moved behind her to fasten it around her neck. "Do you like it?" "I love it. It's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me." She touched the cool stones at her throat. "And you made it yourself, which makes it even more precious." They made love that night for the first time, slowly and gently, Yannick treating her like something infinitely precious. Afterward, lying tangled together under layers of blankets, Felicity felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "Did I hurt you?" Yannick asked immediately, concern flooding his voice. "No, God, no. It's just that I'm so happy and I never thought I could be this happy." She laughed through her tears. 6 months ago, I was in Boston, suffocating in a life that felt like a cage. Now I'm in the wilderness, in love with a mountain man, and I've never felt more free or more myself." He pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "I never thought I'd find someone who understood this life, who could love it the way I do. Most women would look at this and see only hardship and isolation. You see the beauty and the freedom. Because that's what it is, at least for me." She kissed his chest, right over his heart. "I love you, Yannick." "I love you too, Fliss. more than I knew it was possible to love someone. They arrived in Laramie 2 days later, and Felicity got her first look at the town that was supposedly the closest outpost of civilization to their mountain home. It was rough and dusty, a collection of wooden buildings lining unpaved streets, but to her, it looked enormous after months in the wilderness. The noise and bustle of even this small frontier town was overwhelming after the silence of the mountains. Yannick took her to the general store first, where he introduced her to the proprietor, a weathered man named Samuel Hopkins who greeted Yannick like an old friend. "So this is the bride your mysterious benefactor arranged for you," Samuel said, looking Felicity over with frank curiosity. "You look a sight healthier than most city girls we get out here. How are you finding mountain life?" "I love it," Felicity said honestly. "It's hard work, but it's real in a way nothing in my old life ever was." Samuel nodded approvingly. "Yannick, you found yourself a keeper. Most of the mail-order brides we see are crying to go home within a month." While Yannick conducted his business, selling furs and buying supplies, Felicity explored the store. She found fabric that would make a good dress, sturdy cotton in a deep blue that reminded her of the mountain sky. She found dried fruit and real coffee, luxuries they couldn't get in their isolated cabin. She found books, precious books that would help pass the long winter evenings. "Get whatever you want," Yannick said when he noticed her hesitating over the prices. "We did well with the furs this season, and you deserve nice things." She chose carefully, balancing wants against practical needs, and was pleased when Yannick added several items she'd passed over, including a beautiful wool shawl dyed in rich earth tones. "You'll need this," he said firmly. "And it matches your eyes." They spent one night in Laramie's only hotel, a luxury after weeks of sleeping on the ground or in the cabin. Felicity luxuriated in a real bath, hot water carried up by the hotel staff, washing away weeks of accumulated grime. When she emerged clean and dressed in one of her old gowns from Boston, Yannick stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice rough. "I mean, you're always beautiful, but like this, you look like you stepped out of a painting." "I prefer how I look in mountain clothes," she said honestly. "This dress is lovely, but it's not really me anymore, not the me I've become." He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "That's one of the 1,000 reasons I love you. You know who you are, and you're not afraid to be that person." They had dinner at the hotel's restaurant, a surprisingly good meal of beef steak and potatoes. Several other diners stared at them, clearly curious about the mountain man and his lady eating together so companionably. Felicity ignored them, focusing entirely on Yannick as he told her stories about past trips to Laramie, the characters he'd encountered, the changes he'd seen in the town over the years. After dinner, they walked through the streets hand in hand, and Yannick pointed out the small church where the circuit preacher held services when he was in town. "Reverend Mitchell comes through about once a month. We could arrange for him to marry us next time he's here if you want." "I'd like that." She squeezed his hand. "Though I'm in no rush, we have the rest of our lives." "True enough. But I'd like to make it official before too long. I want everyone to know you're mine and I'm yours." They returned to the mountains the next morning, both eager to get back to their cabin despite the comforts of town. Civilization had been interesting for a day, but it wasn't home anymore. Home was a log cabin in the high country, with a view of endless peaks and the sound of wind in the pines. Winter settled in hard after their return, bringing storms that buried the cabin under feet of snow and kept them inside for days at a time. But Felicity didn't mind. Those storm-bound days became precious, time when she and Yannick could simply be together without the constant demands of survival. He taught her to play chess with a set carved from wood and stone. She read aloud from books while he worked on various projects, mending equipment or crafting new tools. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, getting to know each other in the deep way that only comes from extended time together without distractions. And at night, they explored their physical connection, learning what pleased each other, growing comfortable with intimacy. Yannick was always patient and attentive, making sure she was satisfied before seeking his own pleasure. Felicity had been told by other women in Boston that marital relations were something to be endured, a duty rather than a pleasure. But with Yannick, it was joy and connection, and an expression of the love that grew deeper every day. On Christmas, Yannick surprised her by producing a small pine tree he'd cut and decorated with strings of popcorn and berries. It was nothing like the elaborate Christmas trees of her childhood, but it moved her to tears. "I wanted you to have something familiar," he explained. "I know you gave up a lot to be here." "I gave up nothing that mattered and gained everything that does." She kissed him soundly. "But thank you. It's perfect." She gave him a shirt she'd sewn in secret, working on it when he was out checking trap lines. It wasn't fancy, just sturdy cotton cut to fit his broad frame, but she'd embroidered a small pine tree on the chest pocket, a private symbol of their life together. "I'll wear it with pride," he said, pulling it on immediately. "It fits perfectly. How did you learn to sew like this?" "I had a lot of time while you were gone, and I asked Samuel Hopkins for advice on sizing when we were in Laramie. I wanted to make you something practical but personal. It's the best gift I've ever received." He pulled her close. "Merry Christmas, Fliss." "Merry Christmas, Yannick." January brought bitter cold and more snow, until the world outside their cabin was a white expanse broken only by the dark spires of pines. They were completely isolated now, cut off from the rest of the world by winter's grip. But inside the cabin, they'd created their own world, warm and safe and filled with love. In February, when the worst of the winter was past but spring still felt impossibly distant, Yannick took Felicity to meet Tall Elk and his family. It required snowshoes and a full day's travel, but Felicity was determined to meet the people who meant so much to Yannick. The Shoshone camp was tucked into a protected valley, a collection of sturdy winter dwellings surrounded by corrals for horses. Tall Elk himself was an imposing man, taller even than Yannick, with silver threading through his black hair and keen dark eyes that seemed to see right through Felicity. But Dancing Leaves, his wife, was warm and welcoming, embracing Felicity like a daughter and immediately pulling her into the women's lodge to meet the other wives and daughters. Through a combination of gestures, the limited Shoshone Yannick had taught her, and English that several of the younger people spoke, Felicity found herself part of a community of women who accepted her without question. Dancing Leaves examined her hands, noting the calluses and scars from months of hard work, and nodded approvingly. She demonstrated techniques for tanning hides that were more efficient than what Yannick had shown her, and showed her plants that could be used for medicine. The other women taught her songs and asked endless questions about life in the East, fascinated by her descriptions of Boston. Meanwhile, Yannick spoke with Tall Elk and the other men, and Felicity could see the deep respect they had for him. He wasn't an outsider here, but a friend, someone who had earned their trust over years of honest dealing and genuine friendship. That evening, they all gathered around a central fire for a meal. Felicity was surprised by how comfortable she felt, despite the language barrier and cultural differences. These people lived close to the land, respected the wilderness, and valued strength and practical skills over social status or wealth. They were, in many ways, more her people now than the refined society of Boston had ever been. Before they left the next day, Dancing leaves pressed gifts into Felicity's hands. Beautifully tanned leather, herbs for medicine and cooking, and a pair of moccasins lined with fur that fit perfectly. "You are Mountain Woman now," Dancing Leaves said in careful English. "Mountain Woman need good shoes." Felicity hugged her tightly. "Thank you for everything. You make Yannick happy. We see it in his face. That is good. He was alone too long," she smiled. "You come back when baby comes." "I help." Felicity felt her cheeks heat, but she nodded. She and Yannick hadn't discussed children yet, but it was inevitable, wasn't it? And the thought of bringing life into this wild, beautiful place, raising children who knew freedom and strength and love, filled her with quiet anticipation. On the journey back to their cabin, Yannick seemed lighter than she'd ever seen him. "They loved you," he said, grinning. "I knew they would, but it's good to have it confirmed." "I loved them too. Dancing Leaves is wonderful, and Tall Elk, he's intimidating but also kind. I can see why you value their friendship. They saved my life, those first years. I would have died of stupidity if Tall Elk hadn't found me trying to winter in a shelter that wouldn't have lasted through the first serious storm. He took me in, taught me everything I know about surviving up here." Yannick squeezed her hand. "Their family, Fliss. The family I chose. I'm honored to be included in that circle." March brought the first signs of spring, though winter still held the high country in its grip. The days grew gradually longer, and occasionally the temperature would rise enough that icicles dripped from the eaves. Yannick began planning for the spring planting, discussing with Felicity what they should grow, where to expand the garden, whether they had time to clear more land before planting season. "We'll need to make another trip to Laramie in April," he said one evening as they worked together to repair winter damage to various tools and equipment. "We can arrange for Reverend Mitchell to marry us then, if you're ready." "I'm ready." Felicity looked up from the leather harness she was mending. "I've been ready for months. I'm just waiting for you. Then we'll do it. April, when the trails are passable but before planting season gets too intense." He set down the trap he was working on and came to kneel beside her chair. "Felicity Bradford, will you marry me? For real this time, not because anyone arranged it or forced it, but because we choose each other." She set aside her work and framed his face with her hands. "Yes, 1,000 times yes, I choose you, Yannick Brennan. I choose this life and these mountains and the future we're going to build together." He kissed her then, deep and sweet and full of promise. "I don't have a ring yet, but I'll get you one in Laramie, a proper gold band to show the world you're my wife. I don't need gold. That necklace you made me is worth more than any ring could be because you crafted it with your own hands." She touched the turquoise stones at her throat, which she wore every day. "But I'll accept a ring if you want me to have one." "I do. I want to do this properly, give you all the things a bride should have." He pulled her down to sit on his lap. "You gave up so much to come here. The least I can do is give you a real wedding." "Yannick, I didn't give up anything. I escaped. There's a difference." She kissed his nose. "But yes, I would like a wedding. Nothing fancy, just us and whoever we want to witness it, making promises that actually mean something." The rest of March passed in a blur of preparation. The snow finally began to melt in earnest, revealing the world beneath in stages. Felicity helped Yannick clear winter debris from around the cabin, repair damage from storms, and ready the garden plot for planting. She worked until her muscles ached and her hands were raw, and loved every minute of it. In early April, when the trails were finally clear enough for travel, they made the journey to Laramie once more. This time, they had a specific purpose beyond trading and supplies. Yannick had sent word ahead with a passing trader that they needed the preacher, and Reverend Mitchell had agreed to perform a wedding ceremony. Felicity used some of the fabric she'd bought on their previous trip, to make herself a simple wedding dress, blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs. It wasn't the elaborate gown with trains and veils that Boston brides wore, but it was pretty and practical, suitable for the life she was choosing. On the morning of April 15th, in Laramie's small church with Samuel Hopkins and his wife Martha as witnesses, Felicity Bradford married Yannick Brennan. The ceremony was brief and simple, the vows traditional, but when Yannick slipped a plain gold band onto her finger and kissed her to seal their union, Felicity felt the rightness of it in her bones. "I love you, Mrs. Brennan," he whispered against her lips. "I love you too, Mr. Brennan." They celebrated with a dinner at the hotel, joined by the Hopkinses and a few other townspeople who had befriended Yannick over the years. It was modest by Boston standards, but filled with genuine warmth and happiness. Everyone could see how devoted Yannick and Felicity were to each other, and their joy was infectious. That night, alone in their hotel room one last time before returning to the mountains, Yannick made love to his wife with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless. Afterward, lying tangled together in the lamplight, Felicity thought about how strange life was, how the punishment her father had intended had become the greatest gift she'd ever received. "What are you thinking?" Yannick asked, stroking her hair. "I'm thinking that I should write to my father, let him know I married you. Not because I owe him anything, but because I want him to know his plan failed. He wanted to break my spirit, and instead he gave me the chance to find out who I really am. Will he be angry? Probably. He'll see it as defiance, another way I've disappointed him, but I don't care anymore. I'm happy, Yannick, truly, deeply happy. And if he can't be glad for me, that's his loss, not mine." Yannick kissed her forehead. "Then write to him. Tell him whatever you need to say. But know that you don't need his approval or his blessing. We have everything we need right here." They returned to their mountain home as husband and wife, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. Spring swept through the high country in waves of green and gold, wildflowers carpeting the meadows, and Felicity threw herself into the work of planting their expanded garden. Summer came in its turn, warm and bright, and they fell into the rhythms of the season. Yannick hunted and prospected while Felicity tended the garden and chickens, preserved food for the coming winter, and gradually expanded her skills. She learned to ride the horse Yannick acquired from Tall Elk, a sturdy mare named Star who was gentle enough for a novice but strong enough for mountain terrain. Dancing Leaves visited in July, bringing 2 of her daughters, and the women spent days working together, sharing techniques and stories. Felicity's Shoshone was improving, and she could now carry on basic conversations. Dancing Leaves examined her with experienced eyes and announced that a baby would come in winter, news that left Felicity stunned and Yannick grinning like a fool. "I didn't even realize," Felicity said that evening, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I mean, I'd noticed some changes, but I thought it was just from the different diet and all the physical work." "Are you happy about it?" Yannick asked, some uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I know we didn't plan this. I'm terrified," she admitted, "and thrilled and amazed. We're going to have a baby, Yannick, a tiny person who's part of both of us." She took his hand and placed it over her abdomen. "Are you happy? I'm over the moon." He pulled her close. "I never let myself imagine having a family, not really. It seemed like something for other people, not a hermit living alone in the mountains. But now, with you, it feels right. It feels like the next chapter in our story." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into autumn. Felicity continued working as long as she could, determined not to be an invalid just because she was growing a child. Yannick became almost comically protective, worrying about everything from her lifting heavy objects to her going near the woodpile in case she tripped. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she finally said in exasperation when he tried to prevent her from carrying water. "Women have been having babies since the dawn of time while still managing their daily work. I'll be fine. I just want to keep you safe, you and the baby." He looked so earnest that her irritation melted away. "I know. And I love you for caring, but you have to let me continue being useful. I'll go crazy if you try to make me sit still for the next 5 months. She kissed him gently. "How about this? I'll be smart and careful, and I'll ask for help with the truly heavy or dangerous tasks. But you have to trust me to know my own limits." He agreed reluctantly, though she caught him watching her with concern whenever she did anything he deemed remotely risky. But he kept his promise to let her work, and she kept hers to be sensible about what she took on. As winter closed in again, their second winter together, Felicity felt a sense of completeness she'd never imagined possible. Here in this rough cabin, with a baby growing inside her and a husband who loved her, she was more content than she'd ever been in her father's mansion with all its luxuries and privileges. The baby came in late January during a howling blizzard, which was terrifying until dancing leaves appeared through the storm like a miracle, having set out days earlier when she sensed the time was near. With her experienced guidance, Felicity labored through the night and into the dawn, Yannick holding her hand and murmuring encouragements until finally a sharp cry split the air. "A son," Dancing Leaves announced, placing the squalling infant on Felicity's chest. "Strong lungs. Good sign." Felicity looked down at the tiny, perfect human they'd created, and tears streamed down her face. He had Yannick's dark hair and her nose, and 10 perfect fingers and toes that waved in the air as he cried his displeasure at being evicted from his warm home. "He's perfect," Yannick whispered, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "You're perfect. Thank you, Fliss." They named him Jonathan after Felicity's lost brother, with a middle name of Tall Elk in honor of Yannick's friend. Little Jonathan proved to be a healthy, hungry baby who kept them up at all hours, but filled the cabin with a new kind of joy. Watching Yannick with their son melted Felicity's heart daily. This strong, capable man who could face down bears and survive brutal winters became gentle and tender with the tiny infant, singing to him in his deep voice, walking him around the cabin when he fussed, changing soiled cloths without complaint. He was a natural father, patient and loving, and seeing him in that role made Felicity fall in love with him all over again. Spring came, and then summer, and they adjusted to life as a family of 3. Jonathan grew quickly, developing from a tiny newborn into a chubby baby who smiled and cooed and began to explore his world. Felicity managed to balance motherhood with all the other demands of mountain life, though some days she fell into bed exhausted. "You're amazing," Yannick told her one evening as she nursed Jonathan before bed. "I don't know how you do it all." "The same way you do everything you do," she replied. "One task at a time and with the knowledge that I'm building something worthwhile." She looked around their cabin at the life they'd created together. "I never imagined I could be this happy, Yannick. Never in my wildest dreams. Neither did I. I thought I'd live and die alone up here, content with my solitude, but you changed everything." He kissed the top of her head. "You and Jonathan, you're my whole world now." By the time Jonathan was a year old, toddling around the cabin and getting into everything, Felicity realized she was pregnant again. This news was less surprising than the first time, and Yannick's joy was even more evident. "We're going to need that second room," he said, already planning expansions. "Can't have 2 children sharing such a small space forever." Their daughter was born in early spring, an easy birth compared to Jonathan's, and they named her Sarah Grace. She had Yannick's blue eyes and Felicity's lighter hair, and a sunny disposition that had her smiling from just a few weeks old. The years rolled by in a pattern of seasons and growth. They built the second room, added a proper barn, expanded the garden until it produced enough to sell surplus vegetables in Laramie. Tall Elk's family became regular visitors, and Jonathan and Sarah grew up learning both English and Shoshone, comfortable in both worlds. Felicity's father wrote once, a brief letter acknowledging that she had made her bed and must lie in it, but offering no reconciliation or interest in his grandchildren. Felicity felt sadness about the relationship they'd never have, but it was distant sadness, tempered by the richness of the life she'd built. She wrote back once, a long letter describing her life in detail. The cabin, the mountains, her husband and children, the sheer joy of living on her own terms. She told him she'd forgiven him for sending her away, because that banishment had given her everything she'd ever wanted. She never received a response, and eventually she stopped expecting one. His loss, she thought, not to know his grandchildren or to see how happy she'd become. More children came, Thomas, then Elizabeth, then finally Margaret. 5 children in all, each one healthy and strong, raised in the mountains with love and practical skills, and the knowledge that they were valued for who they were, not who anyone expected them to be. When Jonathan was 10 and Sarah 8, they made the journey to Laramie as a family for the first time, all 5 children plus Yannick and Felicity. It was chaos and adventure and exhausting, but also wonderful. Samuel Hopkins, now elderly, was delighted to see how the family had grown. "I remember when you first came through here," he told Felicity. "A scared city girl who looked like a strong wind would blow her over. Look at you now, strong as an ox and happy as a lark." "I found where I belong," Felicity said simply. "That makes all the difference." The children ran wild through Laramie streets with the freedom of young animals, and other townspeople shook their heads at the wild mountain family. But Felicity and Yannick just smiled. Their children were polite and respectful, but also confident and capable. They could ride horses, shoot straight, track game, and survive in conditions that would kill most people. They were being raised to be strong and independent, not decorative or obedient. As the years continued to pass, Felicity sometimes thought about the life she'd left behind in Boston. She heard through occasional letters from an old school friend that her father had died, that the Bradford fortune had been divided among distant cousins since she'd been disinherited. She felt sadness at his passing but no regret for her choices. Her children grew tall and strong, each one developing their own personality and interests. Jonathan showed signs of becoming a skilled hunter and guide like his father. Sarah loved the garden and had a gift for healing, learning everything dancing leaves could teach her about herbs and medicine. Thomas was the wild one, always exploring further than he should, bringing home injured animals to nurse. Elizabeth was practical and organized, keeping her siblings in line with bossy efficiency. And little Margaret was their surprise baby, born when Felicity was 40, bright and curious and absolutely fearless. Yannick aged well, his hair silvering at the temples and his face gaining lines, but his strength never waning. He was still the capable, protective man Felicity had fallen in love with, though now that protectiveness extended to a whole brood of children who adored their father. And Felicity herself, transformed completely from the frightened girl who'd arrived in these mountains so many years ago. She was lean and strong, her hands permanently marked by hard work, her face tanned and weathered by sun and wind. She wore her hair in a practical braid and dressed in sturdy clothing she'd sewn herself. She could outshoot most men, could track game through the forest, could survive alone in the wilderness if she had to. But more than the physical changes, she was confident in a way she'd never been in Boston. She knew her own worth, knew she was capable and strong and valuable. She was respected by the Shoshone, admired by the townspeople in Laramie, and absolutely adored by her family. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Yannick surprised her by taking her back to the spot where they'd first confessed their feelings, that clearing with the overhanging rock where they'd camped on their way to check trap lines. The children stayed with Tall Elk's family, giving them a rare few days alone. They made camp as the sun set, and Yannick pulled out a package wrapped in soft leather. "I made you something. Again." Felicity opened it to find an intricately carved wooden box, the lid decorated with a detailed scene of their cabin, surrounded by mountains and pine trees. Inside were 20 small wooden figures, each one carved and painted with loving detail. Yannick and Felicity, their 5 children, Tall Elk and Dancing Leaves, even the horses and chickens and the cabin itself. "It's our life," Yannick explained, looking almost shy. "Everything that matters, carved and preserved. So years from now, when we're old and gray, we can look at this and remember." Felicity was crying, touching each tiny figure with reverent fingers. "Yannick, this is incredible. How long did this take you?" "About a year. I worked on it when you thought I was just carving spoons or fixing tools." He pulled her close. 20 years, Fliss. 20 years since we made this choice, and I've never regretted it for a single moment. You're still the bravest, strongest, most amazing woman I've ever known. I love you more now than I did then, and I didn't think that was possible. I love you too, so much." She kissed him deeply, tasting salt from her own tears. "Thank you for giving me the choice. Thank you for seeing me as a person when everyone else saw me as a problem. Thank you for these 20 years and for every moment of our life together." They made love under the stars, slower and more tender than in their youth, but no less passionate. Afterward, lying in his arms, Felicity thought about the strange journey that had brought her here. Her father had meant to punish her by sending her to the wilderness, to break her spirit by subjecting her to hardship and isolation. Instead, he'd given her the greatest gift of her life, the chance to discover who she really was, to find a man who loved and respected her as an equal, to build a life of meaning and purpose and genuine happiness. The wilderness hadn't broken her. It had freed her. And the mountain man she'd been sent to, as punishment, had turned out to be the reward she deserved, even if she hadn't known she was looking for it. As they packed up to return home the next day, Felicity paused to look out over the vast expanse of mountains stretching in every direction. This was her home now, in a way Boston had never been. These mountains had witnessed her transformation from a trapped, frightened girl into a strong, confident woman. They'd seen her become a wife, a mother, a valued member of a community that spanned cultures and traditions. "Ready?" Yannick asked, shouldering his pack. Felicity took one last look at the stunning vista, then turned to her husband with a smile. "Always. Let's go home." They walked back through the wilderness together, partners in every sense of the word, heading toward the life they'd built and the family waiting for them. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, silent witnesses to a love story that had flourished in the most unlikely of places, born from punishment but blooming into the most precious of rewards. Years later, when her children were grown and starting families of their own, Felicity would sit on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains she'd come to love, and marvel at the path her life had taken. She'd outlive Yannick by 3 years, and when she finally passed at the age of 78, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, her last thoughts were of that first night in the mountains, when a stranger with kind eyes had given her a choice. She chose right, she thought, as darkness closed in gently. She chose love and freedom and life on her own terms, and it had been more than enough. It had been everything. Her legacy lived on in her descendants, who still worked the land Yannick had claimed so many years ago, still told stories of the city woman who came to the mountains as punishment and found paradise instead, still cherished the carved wooden box with its tiny figures that captured a moment in time when two lonely people found each other in the wilderness and built something beautiful. The mountains remembered too, holding the story in their ancient stone, the tale of Felicity and Yannick Brennan, who proved that sometimes the worst punishments become the best rewards, and that true love can flourish anywhere if given the chance to grow.